benefit, we will be recording this webinar. The slides will also be available post the webinar, and we will be taking questions at the end. But through the presentation, if you do think of something, fire away, but we'll pick them all up at the end, if that's the best way to do it. So over to you, Lucy.
Thanks very much, Alan. Okay, so today I'll be talking about diagnostic assessments and what they can do for you, what they can do for an organisation, what they can do for a learner. I'll be starting off by looking at a few different types of assessments so we can put diagnostic assessments in context. I'll then be looking at the different benefits and what you need to think about when you're actually designing a diagnostic assessment. Finally, I'll move on to how you can use this for course personalisation. So sort of no matter what level of technology you've got, what level of technology you can use, how you can actually utilise a diagnostic assessment to help personalise a course for a learner. And they'll then just give you a couple of examples of diagnostic assessments that Walkgrove has done on two opposite ends of the spectrum, just to show how they can be used in practice. And at the end, if you've got any questions, I'll pick those all up. So feel free at any point, if you've got any questions, just to type them in, and I'll pick those up at the end. Okay, I'll actually be starting off with a quick poll to find out what people who are viewing are most interested in. So I think that should be popping up on your screen anytime soon, and Alan will then go through the results. So you've got a few seconds to answer this, just a quick one.
Yes, I think the poll is really, what we're asking is, which part of it really interests you the most. So, if I guess it's to get an idea of, why are we here? What are you looking at using it for? So I'll just give it another couple of seconds so that we've got everybody's votes in. And I will now close the poll. I think we've got everybody's answers. So that's interesting. We've got 67% of people feel that the most important thing or the most important benefit would be actually the opportunity to personalize courses.
Okay.
And we do have some that are looking at it to tailor courses in the future. So I think, it's a good split, but everybody's obviously interested in, how we can do that.
Okay, that's really great. Those are areas that I'll discuss in more detail later, but it's useful to know that that's the general level of interest that people have, because one of the things that people might want to look at sometimes is sort of return on investment, and I'll cover that briefly, but I'll focus more on how you can use the results. Okay, so to start off with, there are three common types of assessment. They are diagnostic assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment. You may be familiar with the names, you may not be, so I'll just quickly go through them for you. So diagnostic assessment, which is what we'll be looking at today, you take pre-course. So we look at what the learner already knows when they come in to take a course. So it isn't reliant on the course itself, it's based on their existing knowledge. Formative assessment, these are the kind of things you take when you're in formal education. So during the year, you might have class tests so that you know what your progress is going through, and it allows people to provide ongoing analysis of knowledge gain. That's not something we deal with quite so much in e-learning in particular, because there frequently isn't the opportunity. But that is one of the most common types of assessment. And finally, the one that we're probably all most familiar with is the summative assessment. That's the end of course assessment, end of course quiz, where you look back and say, what has been learnt? What is the knowledge gain? So now let's have a quick look at the benefits of assessments. For the learners, I think it's very important to provide diagnostic assessments if you have the opportunity. It gives quite a good level of knowledge for learners. They can review and analyse their existing knowledge. What you might find is that learners aren't always the best at understanding what they already know. In many cases, they might think they don't have a particularly high level of knowledge, but actually they're pretty good. Or they might have too much confidence and think they know something when actually they need to go back and refresh it. What this does, by providing a diagnostic assessment, is provide a snapshot at the very start of the course of what their existing knowledge level is. And that means that they can then find out what they should focus on. They can discover, oh, actually, I don't know quite as much about this as I thought I did, and these are the areas that I would really benefit from learning more about. What we'll cover a bit more later is that you then have the opportunity to provide a personalised learning path. And that's something that can work really, really well for learners. They like to have control. It means that their existing knowledge is recognised and they only need to focus on the things that they're not that great at. And finally, depending on the type of area, you could receive credit for existing knowledge. It may be the case that you actually are giving some CPD points, for example. They may say, oh, actually, you've already got a really high level of knowledge. You don't have to take this course. It may be that the diagnostic assessment could be used as a test of existing knowledge. And if a learner gets a high enough score on it, it might be that they don't have to take the course after that, or only have to take it as a sort of brief refresher. And as some of you are interested in, here's what it can help do for instructors. One thing that can be very challenging when you're actually designing a course is knowing what level of knowledge users really have. And that isn't something that can necessarily be easy to gain. You might have some past experience where people usually know this, but what about the new group of learners that are coming in? Do they have experience from other jobs? Do they have experience from other outside work? And being actually able to gauge what the knowledge level of users when they come into a course is can be really, really helpful. If you're doing this as an e-assessment, it might be that you'll need to tweak the course at a later stage. So for example, you might come in with a diagnostic assessment and a course based on what you thought people knew. But actually, once you've gone through the diagnostic assessment, you can say, well, actually, learners were much better on this than I anticipated, but this area, they all struggled. And actually, in the future, I can tailor this course to make sure that I focus on these areas. Particularly if you're looking at blended programs as well, that really gives you an opportunity to look at what you can do in any face-to-face interventions that you have. So somebody might perhaps take an e-diagnostic assessment online, and afterwards you can go through and say, okay, well actually in the face-to-face training, what I'll do is I'll focus on this and I'll focus on that. And again, it can provide a more tailored experience for learners because you're basing your course design on actual knowledge. What that means is that you're offering something that really meets their needs rather than what you think might meet their needs. I sometimes find when I'm designing a course that the areas that I think are quite straightforward, learners perhaps find more challenging, whereas areas I think they might need a bit more time on, sometimes because of the work that they've been doing previously or what their general roles and responsibilities are, they actually find quite straightforward. So this really gives you some actual knowledge to base your course design. And finally, there are, of course, benefits of diagnostic assessments for organisations. I know this wasn't something that came up in the poll results, but I think it's worth just mentioning briefly, is that if you're actually looking at return on investment, it can be very simple to look at the end of course, the summative assessment, and say, okay, people have done really, really well. Clearly, this was a complete success, and we've had a great return on investment. However, it's important to consider what was the base level of knowledge and understanding that people already had. So it may be that they already came in with a pretty good level of knowledge. Maybe they'd have got 8 out of 10 in a diagnostic assessment, and it went up to 9 out of 10 at the end. Then you look at it and say, well, actually, if we threw a lot of money at this, yes, sure, there was an increase, but it wasn't that much of an increase. Perhaps we should have looked at training on a different initiative. So that's something you can really measure what the return on investment for an individual piece of training is. And another way, again, for helping benefit the learner, what you can do is look at the existing knowledge of the colleagues, and then you can have a look at what the different work support, personal development plans, you can really put those in place for learners. You can look at their diagnostic assessments, and if in general people are struggling in one area, then you can really target and tailor any training initiatives that you have later for them. And that's of course a benefit to the organisation, and it's a benefit to the learners themselves. Right, before we get on to designing assessments, just to remind you that if you've got any questions so far, please don't hesitate to ask them, and I'll go through them all at the end. Alan, is there anything in particular that's come up so far?
Yes, we've had a couple of questions in terms of, where's it best to use a diagnostic and things like that. Mm-hmm. Pretty much some of the discussions that we always have at the beginning of a course saying, mm-hmm. What kind of assessment strategy do you need on this? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think, it's certainly to do with the first poll that we had in terms of what are the benefits you're looking for, and it's pretty much about how do we personalize courses. So yeah,
okay, great.
At the end.
Okay, yep, I'll pick those ones up at the end. What I'll be looking at here is really asking some questions that you'll need to pose to yourselves when you're actually designing a diagnostic assessment. So hopefully that will cover off some of the questions that have been asked so far. But again, if there's anything still outstanding, I'll pick those up at the end. So really, the things that you need to think about before you design a diagnostic assessment, I'll just go through sort of several of the questions you need to ask yourself. One of the things to bear in mind is that no two courses and no two assessments will be the same. And so it's very important to take these as a case-by-case basis. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. What you might find is that for one course, using a diagnostic assessment is a fantastic benefit. And for another course, actually, it isn't as great value for money. So I'll have a look at some of the questions you need to ask yourself to weigh that up. First of all, why do you want to use the assessment? There are a few different ways in which you could be doing it, as we've mentioned already. For example, if you want to measure return on investment, it's really important that you gather quite a lot of data and that you can really analyse that. Whereas if you're creating a personalised course, you might not actually be that interested in the granular data that you get, because in fact the e-learning programme or any later training you do will actually automatically reflect what people have answered. So in those instances, it may be that you don't actually need to gather quite as much data because it's very much learner focused rather than business focused. And I think that's quite important, so that depending on whether you're focusing on the business, you're more likely to need to gather and analyze a lot of data. Whereas if you're actually more learner oriented, particularly if you're rolling out courses to quite a lot of people, you may not have the opportunity to go through all the results. But if you're focusing on the learner and providing them with the enough information and personalizing the courses for them, actually that data isn't as important as what sort of you do with it in the program. Another key consideration is how much time and money do you want to invest? This is something that we always come up against. Anybody who's a learning designer will know that we don't have unlimited pots of money, unfortunately. So we have to think about actually realistically how much time and how much money do I have? So coming back to the first point, what are you going to do with the information? If you've got a really long diagnostic assessment that's really rigorous, the question is, have you got anybody to analyse that data? What are you going to do with it? And as I said before, if actually you just want the learners to find out their areas of strength and weaknesses and go through the courses like that, you may actually decide, I don't really need to analyse that. I don't need to do very much with the information. It's a nice to have, but really that's not the core of what I'm looking for. But again, if you're looking more at how effective the training is, then looking back at those results and analysing them in detail, that can be really important. And again, if you're using it to guide later training initiatives, you want to find out very much who did well, who did badly, what were the areas that were of particular concern, what were the areas that perhaps you don't need to look at in as much detail later. So again, in those instances, you have to think about the amount of time and money that you're going to need to do this. And that's something you really do need to think up front. Frequently, I'll be asked to design a diagnostic assessment or a pre-assessment. And I ask, okay, so what are you going to do with the data? And I might hear people say, well, I haven't really thought about that yet. But it's absolutely key. You can't design a good diagnostic assessment unless you actually know what needs to be done with the data. So that's definitely worth considering. You also need to think about technical limitations. So how are you delivering the diagnostic assessment? So if you're using SCORM 1.2, for example, it may be that you need to actually have that as a separate SCO, so that you can actually gather that data if that's what you need to look at. But again, that slightly affects the learner journey, whereas if you've got SCORM 2004, you might have more flexibility there. So it's very much worth thinking about how you're going to be doing it, what you're going to be doing with the results, and how important the analysis is, because of course analysis takes time and it takes money. But of course, if you're very much focused on making training initiatives better in the future, you might feel that that's a really good investment. Course delivery, another thing to think about. Is your course online only, or is it a blended course? You have a variety of ways in which you can approach things if you've got a blended course, whereas you've got different considerations if it's online only. So for example, if you have an online-only course, the course personalization and anything done within the course has to be addressed later in the course automatically. So essentially, you've got to make sure that you've got the sophistication, robustness within the technology that you're using to actually provide the level of personalization or to provide support or flexibility. So again, if you've got a very, very straightforward course, and a very, very straightforward diagnostic assessment, are you using that in the best way that you can? Is there really the flexibility built into the course to make that diagnostic assessment worthwhile? On the other hand, if you're looking at it for just a business case to see how much knowledge gain there is, then that maybe doesn't matter as much. On the other hand, if you're using a blended course, you have got more flexibility. So you might start off with an e-assessment, as I mentioned earlier, and then you can look through the results before you actually have any face-to-face interventions and decide what's best, what isn't, and how they can be addressed. So if you can address individual results in a face-to-face setting, that's fantastic. It may be that perhaps you can't do it initially, but even if you've got an online-only course, it may be that you can actually look at the results after the course has been completed and see what people knew when they started, and then build that into their personal development plan with individual one-to-one meetings. So there is some flexibility there, but you do need to consider, is this addressed within the course, or do I have another opportunity later? A key question, which again is related to time and money, how much content do you have? When you're thinking about using a diagnostic assessment, I think it's quite important to think, how much content do you really have? How many learning points are there? So you might have a very short course. How much value is a diagnostic assessment really adding to it? If you've only got a few key learning points, maybe the course is 15 to 20 minutes long, is there really enough to make that diagnostic assessment robust? What is it really doing if you're only asking, say, 1 or 2 questions on each topic? Is it really enough to go on? And you may decide, actually, if we've got a very, very short course, that a diagnostic assessment isn't really the way to go. On the other hand, if you've got a very long course with a lot of key learning points, you might need a very substantial diagnostic assessment. Again, you'll need to think about that for time and money, and also how will the learner feel about this. In that instance, I think it's very important to really demonstrate the benefits to learners, to say, okay, with a diagnostic assessment, here's what you'll get out of it, because otherwise they can feel quite intimidated perhaps with an upfront course. So you have to think about how it's going to land with the learner. So again, if you've got a lot of content, that you might find a diagnostic assessment has a lot more value. Perhaps if you've got a few shorter courses, you can string a few diagnostic assessments together to make it seem a bit more worthwhile. But you do need to think about, what am I doing with this? What is the data going to show? How helpful will it be? Can I really learn anything from this? Will the learner really learn anything from the diagnostic assessment. Those are really key things to think about. And it may be that in some instances you say, well, actually, I haven't really got enough to make a diagnostic assessment worthwhile. And that's absolutely fine. They aren't a one-size-fits-all answer. They're something that needs to be used and thought about very carefully, because if you put one in just for its own sake, what has it really accomplished? So again, you need to think about that throughout. How flexible can you be? This is something that's very, very important, and particularly ties in with the course personalization, which I'll talk about more later. Do you have mandatory training? Is it mandatory? Is it optional? Is it regulatory? In some cases, organizations consider that it's absolutely essential that everybody who's taking a course clicks on everything on a screen, answers every single question, sees every single page. And in those instances, unless you're using diagnostic assessments for a business case, you may not have much option for course personalization. That's not to say you shouldn't use a diagnostic assessment, but you have to think, what can I really do with it? If it's for return on investment, then absolutely, that might be something you want to look at. But actually, in other cases where you've got a regulatory course or a mandatory course, you want to make sure that people look at everything. On the other hand, you may use in regulatory training in particular, it may be that what's important is that they pass the test. And it may be that if they have a diagnostic assessment up front, and they score well enough on that diagnostic assessment that they don't need to take the rest of the test. And again, that has a lot of benefits for learners as well. You know, if they come in and say, if you already know this, that's great. You won't actually have to go through the rest of the course, particularly with some mandatory courses and refresher training. It can be quite daunting and off-putting to say, well, I've got to do this again. I've been through my health and safety training every single year. I know what I'm doing, and still having to go through the course, click on everything. The course is locked down. You don't have any freedom to navigate. So if actually you can present the people with a test and say, actually, if you know this already, you can just skip through it. It's fine. Then that can create a lot of goodwill with learners. And again, if you can allow learners to miss sections of the training if they demonstrate competence, then that can again be really, really useful for learners. And that really comes down to some of the course personalization. And if you can be that flexible, that's really great, but sometimes you can't be. And if you can't be, you need to think about what role the diagnostic assessment is playing. Now, how rigorous should the assessment be? Again, this is something I've covered slightly already. So how many key learning points does your course have? If you've only got a few key learning points, it might be that you can create a diagnostic assessment that tests each of them a few different times. On the other hand, if you've got one with, say, a very long sustained course that's maybe got 20 or 30 learning points over a long period of time, it might be that you don't actually have that opportunity to create multiple different questions for it. And generally, if you're just testing each learning point with one question, it's not as rigorous as it could be. So if it needs to be of a very high quality and very high standard, you again need to think about how much does it need to cover? Can we test things multiple times? Is it something that people can just guess their way through? Again, with the course personalization, can learners skip parts of the course? If they can, or skip the course altogether, it's really important that the diagnostic assessment is pretty rigorous. If you've got something that's very simple, that's quite encouraging, that learners won't feel particularly challenged by, but will perhaps be reassured by and their confidence be improved, which again is a very good way to use a diagnostic assessment, it does mean that actually it might not be that useful for allowing them to personalize the course in a significant way. If it's more about reassuring people that they have a good level of knowledge, perhaps surprising them with facts or myths, then actually it isn't so useful for diagnostic purposes. And it may be then that while you can say, okay, here are the areas that you're worse at, here are the areas you're better at, you might not want to allow people to skip parts of the course. And again, if you're using it to see how people have done and how courses have been taught previously, particularly if you're looking at refresher training, and if you're going to be changing the course, amending it, depending on the results of diagnostic assessment, again, you want that to be a bit more rigorous. You want to really gauge a person's level of knowledge. Again, with this, one of the things to remember is that everything that applies to creating robust end of course assessments also applies for diagnostic assessments. It's not just an easy, or here are a few things, let's throw in a few different options here. It's very much you need to provide good distractors if you're using a multiple choice format. You need to think about and plan it as carefully, or perhaps even more carefully than you would plan an end of course assessment. So when you're thinking about that, you'll need to make something that's more rigorous if you actually want to base your future courses and tailor things based on that. And okay, finally moving on to the part that people are probably most interested in. Just to remind you again, if you've got any questions, please just share them and I will pick those up at the end. But course personalisation we'll move on to now. So I'll start off by looking at online courses. I've split this into 3 different sections. So with online courses, we can look at basic, intermediate, and advanced. Generally, that's dependent on the level of technology and sophistication you can have within your course. For example, if you've got a very, very low budget course, it might be that there isn't much that you can do cost-wise, and some technologies you might find are actually quite limited. You don't have as many options for course personalization. However, that doesn't mean you can't do it. So in the very basic level of diagnostic assessments, what you can do is explain to learners at the end of the course which question matched up with which topic, what they'll be looking at. What that means is that you can say at the end, you scored 3 out of 5, the questions were X, Y, and Z. These topics relate to these questions. These are the questions that you got right, so you don't need to think about those areas quite so much. What that gives is flexibility for the learner. It means that they can take those recommendations on board. They've now got a better idea of what their level of knowledge and experience is, and they can then say, oh, actually, I can skip through this part more quickly, not to say necessarily to skip it altogether, but I don't need to give quite as high a level of focus because it will be asking me things I already know. Whereas in other areas, I can focus on these more because I know I struggled at the quiz and I know that I'll be assessed again at the end. I need to focus on those. So even within a very basic online course, you've got the opportunity for a sort of quasi-personalization. What that means is that it's not built in a particularly technical fashion. You may not have any options for flexibility or profiling, but what you can do is tell the learner up front, here's what you did well on, here's what you did not so well on, and guide them to focus on those areas. So again, it doesn't require much sophistication, and even if you've only got quite a low level or low budget, that's something you can incorporate so you've still got that level of personalization. With an intermediate course, you can make things a bit more personalized. So for example, your results page might not just say, these are the topics and these are the areas. You can actually provide more personal feedback based on the answers, which can then provide a recommended learning path. It might not be one that is automatically generated. So it may be that learners will still have to go through and find the topics, but it means that they could print out, for example, they could, for example, print out a learning path and then follow that. Finally, if you've got more sophisticated technology or options or a higher budget, what you can get is a really, really closely personalized course. And I think this is something that we should all be aiming for if we can do it. We can't always. We do have budget constraints sometimes. We do have technological constraints. But if you can, if you've got the option to really personalize a course, I think it's really fantastic for learners, because what they see is, okay, they've really paid attention to what I need to know, to what I'm not so good at, and they've really taken into account that we're all individuals. Because very much with e-learning, you come in and you say, oh, actually, it's very much one size fits all. Everybody sees the same course unless you've got some profiling based on roles, for example. But actually profiling based on diagnostic assessments results, you can put something together really, really well that shows them, okay, this is your personalized learning plan. These are the topics we will include. These are the topics we won't include. And actually things are done in a way so it's quite dynamic, so that rather than just say, right, this is your personalized learning plan, follow it. It can actually be dynamically generated so that what they see very much depends on their answers to the diagnostic assessment. And that is something that is really great because it saves learners time, it increases their goodwill, and it makes them feel, okay, this training initiative is really important. They have thought about me as the learner. They're not just slapping something in front of us rather than thinking about what we actually need to know. As I mentioned before, there's probably more flexibility for using diagnostic assessments with blended courses. So in instances where you've got face-to-face training, it's likely to be at some time after people have taken a diagnostic assessment or online test. And so people have the opportunity to actually go through and look at the results. So if you're an instructor and you're working in a blended course, then what you can do is set the diagnostic assessment early and then have an opportunity to go through that and use that to shape your syllabus, to shape your face-to-face training, what courses are included or excluded. It also means, depending on the number of students you have, particularly if you're if you're giving face-to-face training, it may be that you're taking smaller class sizes through something, so maybe 15, 20, 30. And then you can go through and identify if there are any problem areas for people specifically, and then offer them specific training or assistance on areas that they perhaps have felt that they struggle with, or they're not quite as confident in. So you can offer supplementary coaching. You can go through and set up a really great personal development plan because you've separated out the diagnostic assessment. And again, it creates great goodwill. It makes that the learner feels that they're really being paid attention to, they're being really well considered. So it makes them feel good about themselves. It makes them feel good about the training. They feel that their time isn't being wasted. They feel that actually everybody's on their side. They're trying to improve things for them. So it's very much a learner-focused approach. Whether it's an online-only course or whether it's a blended course, it's really making sure that you're focusing on how can I do the best that I can for the learners? How can I make sure that what they're getting is the information that they really need to know? How can I improve their development? And that's great for the business as well as for the learners and for the instructors. Okay, finally, just got a couple of screens to just talk about the way in which two different organisations used diagnostic assessments very, very differently. The first example is Transport for London, very much knowledge-based, had both a diagnostic and a summative assessment, and very much intended to measure knowledge gain across the duration of the course as part of a wider return on investment initiative. So in that instance, it was less important for course personalisation. So while learners found out what score they got at the end, they didn't actually find out which topics they did well on, which they did poorly on. So they might say, okay, you got 5 out of 10, or you got 7 out of 10. But because it was very much business driven, that was the primary reason for including a diagnostic assessment, and the client was not as interested in course personalisation. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we had the post office, and this, unlike the TfL one, was very much intended to encourage learners to judge practice and confidence levels, so that people could then see how much their knowledge had improved across the course. And rather than for their managers or for the business to measure this, actually it was very much focused on the learner themselves, so that they gave an assessment of their own confidence, and a fully personalised learning profile was generated at the start based on their answers to this. So again, we're looking at a completely different way in which a diagnostic assessment is used. They weren't interested in the same way in return on investment, and they were teaching for more senior staff members, and actually it was more important that the learner felt comfortable with the course, that they understood the benefits, and that they saw a personalised learning plan. So in summary, before we move on to any questions, overall I think diagnostic assessments are a really important tool in your training kit. I don't think they're used as frequently as they should be, but I also think they're not necessarily used as well as they could be. And hopefully this presentation will have given you some thoughts on what you can do to create a better diagnostic assessment in the future. It's important to always think about what you want to achieve with it. Don't just put in a diagnostic assessment because somebody said we want a diagnostic assessment. Challenge them, push back. What do you want to do with it? What's important for you? Remember that when you're creating an effective assessment, you need to think about making it as robust and hard to cheat as possible. So if you're creating a good end of course assessment, you need to apply the same principles to your diagnostic assessments. It shouldn't be sort of the quick and easy option, we'll just slide that in at the front. It needs to be just as robust as any other assessment that you'd include. And perhaps even more, depending on what you're using it for. If a learner is able to skip out parts of a course depending on what they've answered for the diagnostic assessment, it's really important that you're actually measuring their knowledge in a really valid and robust way. And finally, I think diagnostic assessments are fantastic for course personalization. As a learner, I want to know that people have taken into account what my previous knowledge and previous experience levels are. I want to know that my time isn't being wasted on things that I already know. I want to feel that I'm being treated as an individual, as a person. I don't need to be spoon-fed. I need to know what I'm good at, what I'm not so good at, so I can really focus in on the problem areas. So for personalization, I think diagnostic assessments offer a lot. Okay, so I'll pass over to Alan, who's going to be summarising the questions and throwing those over to me. If you've got any thoughts while we're going through, please feel free to send them across.
Yeah, I think, it's a great, you ended on personalization, and I think one of the key questions that we've got this morning is to do with that. It says, if someone passes the diagnostic assessment, would you actually recommend they don't take the rest of the training? And how can you guarantee they don't miss something of value?
I think guaranteeing that they don't miss something of value, I think that's a really good question. With the things of value, do they already know it? And again, it comes down to the robustness of that diagnostic assessment. If you don't have a particularly robust diagnostic assessment, I wouldn't recommend saying that people can completely skip out parts of the course. If you're not confident in your diagnostic assessment, then you need to think about actually how could I make that more challenging, more robust? Or you can say, okay, well, that's fine, but we won't allow people to completely skip over things. So it's really a balancing act from your end to really think about what's the best way in which I can approach this for the learner, for me, for the organisation. So in some instances, it might be that even if people have done really well in the diagnostic assessment, you actually don't want them to miss anything out. It may be you said focus in on these bits, but you still have to go through the rest of the course. You might not need to pay as much attention to it, but actually you still need to go through it. So in those instances, it might be that you want to direct their attention to problem spots, but it doesn't mean that you want them to skip things out. So again, it really depends on, if you've got a very long diagnostic assessment, you feel confident actually they know everything they need to know, then that's great. If there are some key things that you think everybody needs to know anyway, absolutely put those up front and make sure that people read them.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. There's two other quick ones which we can whiz through, conscious of time. One is it worth using more than one type of assessment in the same e-learning course, i.e. diagnostic and summative?
Absolutely. I think it's very, very much worth using both, depending on what you want to gain. So for example, if you're looking at knowledge gain across a course, you absolutely need to pair any diagnostic assessment with a summative assessment. And generally, it's good for people to get a quiz at the end of the course so that they feel reassured that they've learned something from it. So I would say that you can absolutely use both types of assessment. You don't need to think that you can just use one or the other. You can absolutely use both, but you also need to make sure that you're not overwhelming the learner and that you're using these in the best possible way. if you're not really looking to personalize your course much, or if you're not really looking to measure return on investment, if you're not going to use the results from the diagnostic assessment, perhaps think about leaving it out but making a better end of course assessment. On the other hand, if you've got the time, you've got the budget, and it's important to you to find this out, you really do want to personalize the course for learners, you want to make sure that in the future you actually focus on the things that are really important for learners, then yes, using a diagnostic assessment is really important, and that can very much be paired with a summative assessment.
Okay, and I think there's one last one which we can look at, which says, are there any specific kinds of training courses where you think diagnostic assessments are more effective or most effective?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that generally it can be very useful in skills-based courses. It really depends on what you're testing. So, for example, if somebody goes to a course that actually is very much skills-based, but they can already demonstrate that they have these skills, then it is really helpful to know before they actually start the course. For knowledge-based things, in a similar way, it depends, do you want to test what people do with the knowledge, or do they just need to have the knowledge? I generally think that diagnostic assessments work best when it's not so much sort of off the top of the head knowledge based, and more based on how people put things into practice, look at their skills, unless it's an area where sort of the key underpinning knowledge is really important. So that's probably where I'd focus them. If you actually want to say, we've got some behavior changing training, or we need to see what people are doing in their existing practice, then actually looking at using a diagnostic assessment can be really good. With a knowledge-based test, you have to say, okay, do people actually need this knowledge at their fingertips, or is this something where they can have a reference tool up during their work? And in those instances, it might be that it's not quite so important. So I'd say focusing on ones where they need to put something into practice can be really good. On the other hand, it might be that, for example, if you're looking at something more academic, or if you're looking at something that's perhaps got some CPD points associated with, then it's not quite so important to make the sort of skills and knowledge distinction. That's probably where I'd come down on that. Okay, great. And I think, like I said, I'm conscious of time, so we will put the rest of the questions up on our blog. So, if you do have any further questions, fire them across to us. Before we leave, if I can just bother you for some feedback. Helen has given us some feedback on the back channel chat, which we will certainly look at for the next one. But if I can quickly have your views on, did you find this useful? And yes, we've got answers to that, and everybody felt it was. Quick question in terms of our own understanding. Are webinars useful? Would you like to attend them? Are they a major source of information for you? Again, thank you for your answers on that. And before we let you go, just one final one, which is, post this, what information can we send you? Would you like to see? Like I said, the recording will be up, the slides will be up on our website. There is a white paper which we can send you as well. And of course, if you would like to have a chat with Lucy, perhaps we can set that one up as well. So thank you very much. We've got all the answers in there, very interesting. So we will certainly keep you posted of everything that we do in the future. And with that, I think it's only left for us to say thank you very much for attending. I hope you did find it useful. We will certainly make the opportunity to engage with one another while you are watching our webinars in the future part of our next one, and keep you posted. So thanks very much for attending, and have a lovely day. Thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you've got any questions, please send them over, and I'll do what I can to answer them for the blog, or if you've got any individual questions to answer personally.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. And like I said, have a great day. Bye for now.